It's Reality Check with Craig Price.
I'm an idiot.
4 minutes in and I'm already wrong.
I'm like a monkey. Hello, look at me. Craig, shut up.
Hey, I need you guys to do these things.
You're like a beautiful mind. I'm more like Forrest Gump. So it's Reality Check with Craig Price. This week, Arin Reeves joins me to discuss inclusion. Welcome to the podcast. We've got another great presenter from the Association of Legal Administrators Region 2 Conference, which will be in Atlanta on September 28th and 29th. I, of course, will be opening and closing that particular conference. And when I saw that Arin was going to be included in the conference, I knew that I needed to get her on because when she talks about inclusion, she's not just talking about including people of different races or different genders or the typical prejudicial things that we think of about when we need to include others, but she is talking about inclusion in all forms, especially people with opposing viewpoints. This ability to see any other side of something other than your own is a lost art for people. I rarely see people take the effort to express the fact that they can understand or see what the other person is trying to say. Somehow, if you can hold two opposing views in your head at the same time, you're considered a witch in this country, and the stoning begins. But being stuck in your ways can end up hurting you in the long run, and new ideas are going to be needed to grow. As a person, as a business, as a country, you don't know everything. You don't understand every single thing. It's important that you get other people's ideas to help you. And so Arin is here to help us out and not only be comfortable enough to be open to seeing other people's views, but actively using the information. So let's get right to it, or include, if you will, Arin Reeves. How did you get involved in doing all of this? What is your background? Because it sounds, when I looked at it, what you're talking about being inclusive, it sounds like you're dealing with underlying prejudices that a lot of us may not be aware of.
Right. I started off my career in law. So I graduated from law school and I practiced law for several years. And one of the areas that I practiced was in the public sector. So I represented children who were sexually abused, and really at that point was trying to understand why the lawyers that represented the children did not really reflect the communities that the children came from. So I started getting interested in the issue, interested enough to go back to school and get my PhD in this area. And I think it is less about prejudices and more about what are the barriers that we either put up ourselves or exist that prevent us from maximizing our potential. So, I think each of us comes into this world with a lot that we can contribute, and I've always been really fascinated with the idea of what do we do in workplaces and sometimes in educational institutions, but a lot in workplaces that really prevent people from contributing to their maximum capacity.
And the book is The Next IQ, The Next Level of Intelligence for 21st Century Leaders. And my guest today is Arin Reeves with PhD, which is always good. It's always good to talk because I talk on some subjects that deal with psychology and things like that. And when you don't have a PhD, people start wondering. So you've got the clout to back this up. And you've done a lot of research on it. It's really about inclusion and how we can include ourselves and other people into our organizations.
Absolutely. And my research started while I was doing my PhD. Originally when I started the Firm Connections, it was 1999, so it was based out of some of the research coming out of my dissertation. But since then, one of the things our firm does is we do a lot of research on a consistent basis so that the ways in which we help our clients and the ways in which we talk about things are always based on sort of current research.
Sure. And before we can start talking about how we can include, what are some of the things that we do that stop us from including? Because I know that there's just on my own, and I haven't done any research, I just read the news, that we have a tendency to gravitate towards the familiar. They did some research with kids with glasses, and they said kids with glasses are more likely to sit in the cafeteria at school with kids with glasses. So
absolutely,
subconsciously, they are including the kids with glasses, but also excluding other people. So what are some of the barriers that are there for people who are when we try to think about inclusion? What are the barriers to inclusion?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things, a lot of our research is really based on, we start with sort of neurobehaviorally, what are we most likely to do? Not because we consciously say we want X or we want Y, but because our brain actually makes a lot of decisions for us before we actually think we're thinking. So our brains are, at the end of the day, they're very, very lazy creatures. What they want to do.
I can attest to that, very much so. I think mine I had to wake mine up before I started this phone call.
Absolutely. And a lot of times what our brains look for is they look for shortcuts to what is going to be okay. So our brains are always looking for things where we'll feel safe, where we feel that something is predictable and we feel that something is easy and it won't be uncomfortable. So our brains are constantly looking for choices that feel similar and predictable and comfortable and easy. So the way, when we walk into a room, we kind of try to see who looks to be the person that we're most safe with, that we can predict behavior from, that will be the easiest to relate to. And we tend to gravitate towards that. So it's really about, most biases, quote unquote, that exist in people's minds are really about biases towards ease and comfort, not necessarily that we're biased against people. More of our brain's biases are about what we prefer as opposed to what we don't prefer. So by default, what happens is when we lean towards certain things, when we are moved towards certain things, we are moving away from other things without necessarily recognizing it. So I think that's a big barrier. I think another barrier is that, we are raised in a world where we are taught that it is more important, that it's very important to be right, that it is very important to be successful. And some of the discomfort that we feel around differences suggests to our brain that, maybe we're headed towards failure, or maybe we're headed towards risk, or maybe we're headed towards something that we can't predict the outcome of. And because we are such a success-driven society and such a anti-failure society, that risk and that discomfort seem like something we should avoid at all costs. So it's both sort of what our brain is doing neurologically, but also societal expectations of success and, of not failing, that sort of work towards us always moving towards what we can predict and what feels more similar to us.
Well, I'll throw this out to you because I constantly hear, and I feel it's completely wrong, but I constantly hear this fear of success, which I don't really believe is true because I don't think people fear success. I think they fear failure at a higher level in front of more people. They'll take the money, they'll take the prestige, they'll take the power, but the fear is not because they're getting more successful. I think the fear is that they are going to look stupid, look wrong, look not right, as you say, in front of, now instead of just their bosses, now the entire company, or instead of just a few select people, now it's a whole bunch of people, it's thousands of people. Do you think that fear of success actually exists? Is that something that that also exists as well as fear of failure?
I definitely think that once you've achieved a comfortable level of success, the risk involved in getting to that next level gets higher and higher, right? So it's more and more risk to get to the next level because you've already achieved a certain level of success. So I think this concept of a fear of success is as you said, it seems riskier and riskier to shoot for higher and higher. So people tend to say, for whatever reason, no, I'm just fine here. Don't bother me. I'm comfortable here. I also think the other thing that happens is, we're in a society where we really teach people that it is through this success, it is through this adulation that you get from others where you discover your happiness. And part of what happens is people sort of rise through these ranks or through the corporate ladder or whatever metaphor you want to use, is they realize with every success, they don't necessarily feel better. They don't necessarily, feel anything beyond that momentary, oh yeah, I got promoted, but the next day your life hasn't changed. Nothing has really changed. So I think there is a skepticism about what is it that I'm shooting for? What is it? I think a lot of people it's more about, I don't know what success means. So it's more about the fear of not knowing what success means as opposed to the fear of success itself. Because I think if people are articulating success in a way that makes sense to them, I can't imagine that it would be something that they're afraid of. But it's sort of all the different ways that we present it, and people haven't had a chance to think about it organically, that they then trigger fear instead of, motivation or anything else.
So how can we push past some of that fear, especially of failure and of risk? No one gets anywhere without taking some sort of risk. I mean, even in relationships, someone has to take the risk of asking one of the other two out. No one gets married by accident. Well, in some countries,
right.
In some countries, it does happen. But
even in those countries, it's not by accident; it's by somebody's purpose. So.
Right, somebody is. We'll say, I know your home country is India, where they have some arranged marriages.
Yes, I was born there.
Well, and that's some arranged marriages. Even that is they're risking. Someone's got to go ask another family. Hey,
absolutely.
We'd like to partner up because you've got money, we've got this, we've got that. Let's do this. Someone's got to take the risk. So how can we push past that fear?
I think a big part of it is really understanding, and this is what, one of the primary principles in the Next IQ, that we need to move past a concept of right versus wrong to a concept of multiple rights. And I think that is a big part of why we get stuck and we're afraid of success and we're afraid of failure. And, some of the things that you talk about in your book, it's one of the reasons we're so scared to say no, and we don't really understand, we're so intent on wanting to appear right, wanting to appear correct, wanting to appear the proper way. And, we want to be doing what we should be doing, as you talk about. And I think that one of the ways to sort of step back and get more comfortable with risk is to think about it from the perspective of, just because I say X and someone says Y, it doesn't mean one of us has to be right and the other wrong. So let me actually think about what would the universe look like if X and Y were correct. And it's the ability to say, what does it look like when I can hold two opposing thoughts in my head and not have them conflict with each other, but have them coexist with each other? I think allows us to take risks with people, with ideas, with our careers in a way that that doesn't make us feel like there's only one way and it's either right or wrong. There's many different ways to get here, and we can pursue all of those ways or some of those ways simultaneously. And you brought up the idea of arranged marriage. It's really interesting. What happens a lot in India these days is that, parents tell their sons and daughters, go out, meet somebody. We're also going to work on an arranged marriage. Let's see which one happens and which one works out to the best, so that there isn't like you're not allowed to date because we're going to arrange a marriage, or go out and date and we're not going to do anything. I think when people say, why can't both of these happen at the same time, and how can we make a different alternative possible at the same time, then the risk is reduced. I also think that when we seek out differences, when we have the courage to have very, very different perspectives in our personal lives and in our professional lives, so we don't fall into a pattern of, all my friends are so much like me, all my friends think like me, all my friends look like me. But really that when I look at my group of friends, I have friends from different countries, I have friends from very different backgrounds, I have friends that span the political spectrum, I have friends that believe in lots of different things, that when I go to them and I say, hey guys, I'm thinking about doing X, the perspectives that I get about X are so broad and so integrated and so complex that my ability to think through all of the different risk propositions to make a decision is just so much better informed because I have all these diverse perspectives helping me. So I think it is those two things combined. It's about allowing for differences to exist without a right or wrong judgment, and seeking out differences to actually inform your perspective that can allow us to just get much better with risk, get much better with our own worldview, get much better solving problems and parenting and everything else.
Well, it's obvious you're not going to go into politics with that attitude. Because
not American politics today.
No, I think that's the biggest problem is that the media has kind of divvied themselves up into right and wrong.
Absolutely.
And there is no middle ground. You can't possibly have two opposing views in your head. Otherwise, you're flip-flopping or you're waffling or you're not being true. It's like with all that circling around us, what are some techniques? Since a lot of this is subconscious, so some of this is kind of not necessarily learned behavior, but just kind of it's just instinctive for a lot of these folks because they're beat over the head with media or the way they were raised. How can we start getting out of that pattern?
That's a really good question. I think a big part of that is when we begin any process, whether it's a problem-solving process, a mate-finding process, a parenting process, is to really step back and say, what do I want to achieve? Because some of these things are only, they can only corrupt us insofar as we adapt other people's perspectives. And I was saying to somebody this the other day, they said, what would be, if you were to run for president today, what would be the number one thing that you would do? And I said, I would promise, I would sign a contract, I would do whatever it took so people understood I was only going to serve one term. Because the reason that I think we have this craziness in politics is because our actions today, what we want to accomplish today, conflict with getting elected tomorrow. So when we have two opposing purposes kind of working towards us at the same time, it's impossible for us to take some of these risks and get diverse perspectives and all of this because we are both trying to be offensive and defensive at the same time, right? So I think with politicians, sometimes it's a matter of saying, what is it that you want to accomplish right now? And if they're honest, what a lot of them say is, well, I want to accomplish healthcare reform, but I also want to get reelected next year.
Right.
And those two can't coexist. And I think if the American public really wanted our politicians to just even act reasonable, let alone,
well, now you're just dreaming if you're going to think they're going to. You're going wild if you're asking them to be reasonable.
Absolutely, but I was working with a CEO recently that where he had a senior leadership team that would always infight with each other. They were always sort of clawing at each other. And when he and I had a very honest discussion one day, I said, well, does it have to do with how you reward people? And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, they're clawing for a reason, right? They want something. What is that thing? And he said, that's really interesting. I don't know. And I said, well, let's take a look at it. And when we looked at it, what we discovered is all of them perceived that there was a particular pot of bonuses that they had to fight for percentages, right? So if they accomplished something in their unit, in their business unit, at the expense of another business unit, they actually perceived themselves as having greater access to a higher bonus. And so the CEO and I sort of sat down and we worked out, well, what does it look like if we make each person run their own race, right? So it's about sort of topping your own time as opposed to winning over other people, and made it more of a relay race. And that was the example that we used. So if product development got it to this point, then marketing took it over, and we talked about sort of the cycle of how all of these functions needed to work together. What happened is now that we have changed the incentive, people started collaborating instead of competing, and they were competing for a common goal as opposed to competing against each other. And I think that what has happened in Washington is we're no longer competing for a common goal. We're no longer competing for a common sort of, we want to, reduce the debt, or we want to reduce, the deficit, or we want to, balance a budget, or we want to accomplish this. We don't have that unified cohesion, which then allows for diverse perspectives to work together. So I think as long as you have divergent goals, diverse perspectives actually create more conflict, and don't do well, right? But if you have a unified goal, then diverse perspectives allow you to accomplish that goal in a stronger, more powerful, collaborative way.
And I can certainly see that it can be difficult to change as a person. I mean, if you have these biases or you have these perspectives and you're going to learn to change. But if you've gotten to the point where you can make these changes so that you can take these risks, how can you then, because this was a particular situation where you were talking about bonuses, and so that is a specific goal that we can quickly relate to. They're going to do it because they want to make money. So if we make sure everybody gets a bonus because everybody does work, they'll all work together. But how can we change from individually and then make that go through an organization? Because your example is great for a financial compensation situation, but what if you're just implementing a new policy where there is no immediate financial benefit? It's just a benefit in general. How can we get that perspective throughout an organization?
Absolutely. I mean, one important thing to realize is most of our brains fight change, right? We only change for two reasons. One is either the change is going to bring about pleasure that we don't have or is going to avoid pain that we do have. That's it. Those are only two reasons for change. That's the only two reasons that human beings change. And I think that leaders, when you want to, create behavioral change, there has to be an incentive. Now, the incentive doesn't have to be financial. It can be social. It can be personal. It can be emotional. It can be ease. It can be a more efficiency in the way you do your work. But I think a lot of times what organizations do is they say, change because I told you to change. Our brain does not like that at all. Change because I told you to change means I am going to agree in your face and passively resist you for the rest of my life.
Yeah, ask any teenager. That's how teenagers think. As soon as you tell them
exactly.
This is how it's going to be done, then they do it a totally different way.
Exactly. And so I think the art of leadership, and one of the reasons, in my book, I bring all this back to leadership, is it's really about, as a leader, do you understand what incentivizes the people in your organization? There are lots of organizations that have incentivized tremendous change without necessarily it having anything to do with compensation. And so it's about finding out. So if you're working in a not-for-profit, you're going to have a different incentive than if you're working in the government, than if you're working in a for-profit. And in a for-profit, if you're working in a public company, you're going to have a different incentive than a private company, or an entrepreneur is going to have a different incentive, or a new working mom is going to have a different incentive than somebody who doesn't have kids. But it's really about stopping and saying, okay, I want to create different behavior in the workplace than the behaviors that exist right now. I have to understand what is driving the current behaviors in order for me to then create the incentives to change the behaviors. And I think that is the leadership challenge of being able to do that. I mean, it's the same reason why, but when you look at the psychology of why do people stop smoking? Why do some people follow a diet and lose weight and other people follow the same diet and don't lose weight? Why do, two different parents have the exact same parenting guidelines given to them and one of them implements it and the other person doesn't, even though they both love their children? We can look at lots of examples in society to see how it isn't just about teaching people how to do something. You have to understand what's important to them as to why they should change. And I think that's the critical component in any organization, is leaders needing to understand and then eventually speak to and incentivize around that why.
And sometimes that why can be hidden. It's not as some whys are not obvious.
Absolutely.
So do you have any techniques or any specific questions we should ask to try to pull that why out of people?
Absolutely. I mean, you can do focus groups, you can do surveys, but a really big question that you can ask people is, sometimes we tend to devalue things in our society that don't have a monetary value, and we sort of overvalue things that have a monetary value. So sometimes in an organization, I've worked with some managers before where, in order to have conversations with people that elicit what those real incentives are, I ask them to have hypothetical monetary conversations. what would you pay to have one day a week where you telecommute? Like, given your salary right now, what would you actually pay, or what amount of salary would you give up to be able to have one day a week where you telecommute? And it's really interesting because now people are comparing apples and apples, right? So they're creating a monetary value for something that they might not see as having a monetary value. And they're saying, oh, okay, so if this is my salary, gosh, you know what? I would take 10% cut to be able to work from home because that's how important it would be to me. And now managers can say, okay, so now we can start creating sort of a monetary value around this. And if it is 10% and we ask people to, forego a 5% raise and we offer this, we have a greater chance of incentivizing them. So it's about, in any organization, it is about sort of creating apples and, it's just about comparing apples and oranges and oranges. And sometimes it is about asking the questions in a creative way. Sometimes it's as simple as saying, instead of saying, can you do X, to how can you do X, so that you're helping people. I guess it's difficult for me to articulate, but it's what you're doing is you're helping people see what the cost or benefit to them is for this change, and you're helping them sort of either monetize it or quantify it so that then you can start working towards, giving it back to them in a way that makes sense to them.
Sure, you're just framing it in a way that they can understand it. And
absolutely.
Sadly, in America, it has to be monetarily.
It is, absolutely. And in other countries, it has to do with honor and duty, and in other countries, it has to do with free time and leisure. But in this country, unfortunately, it is monetary, and it is visible success, right? So it's a title, it's a role, it's visibility of success, and monetary are the two primary drivers in this country.
Now, the last question before I let you go is, because you talk about this visible success, and the first thing that jumped out of my mind is generationally, does that span? Because I know baby boomers, they grew up thinking a title and a big salary define them. So if them being a manager is not a big deal. Them being vice president of the Eastern Division and them making $200,000 a year is a big deal. I'm finding that younger generations don't really care about the titles. They do like the money, but they're more willing to give up money to do that leisure, to do more things with their free time. So do you see this concept having to change drastically between generations, or is this you found this pretty common amongst every age?
No, there's definitely a huge generational shift. I mean, for Gen X and Gen Y, what you find is they usually have an amount in their mind that they want to make in order for them to live the life that they want to live. So for them, it's a much more internally focused sort of monetary goal. For baby boomers, it was a comparative goal. Like, even if I have enough to give, I want to make more than so-and-so, right? If I'm a VP in the company, I want to be the highest paid VP. If I am the CEO, I want to have a higher salary than other CEOs in my industry. So there's always, for baby boomers, there's a comparative component to their compensation that Gen X and Gen Y doesn't have. So if Gen X says, well, somebody in Gen X would say, this is the life I want to live, this is how I want to provide for my family, this is generally what I want to make. If I'm making that, I really don't care what somebody, in the office next to me is making, because it doesn't affect my life. So they don't have that same kind of comparative response. And with Gen Y, what's really interesting is they don't care about title. They care more about ownership, in that they want to be able to own projects because they love the process of running something on their own. So they will list you a title for, greater responsibility any day. And I think that it is a primary area of conflict between, baby boomers and with, Gen Y, especially because what Gen Y will say is, you can keep your title, give me a greater flexibility or give me a different project. And I would rather do that than chase a title. And for baby boomers, sometimes that can be perceived as, well, you're not committed or you're not ambitious because you're not chasing this title. And Gen Y is like, no, I am ambitious. I just don't want the stupid title. So there is this sort of confusion. And I think over the next 10 years, as we see, over 50 million baby boomers retire, it is going to bring about a very, very sharp change, cultural change in our workplaces that I don't think, many workplaces are prepared for.
Of course, there's the caveat that we hope they can afford to retire in the next 10 years. A lot of people's 401ks disappeared, so their retirement plans went out the window. But the book is The Next IQ, The Next Level of Intelligence for the 21st Century Leaders. Where can we find it?
It is on Amazon. So that would be the easiest place to find it. But you can also read some blogs around it and some additional information about the book on thenextiq.com.
Well, Arin, I appreciate your time. I want to remind people, since this is coming out beforehand, you will be at the Association of Legal Administrators Region 2 conference with myself at the end of September, I believe it's the 28th, the 29th, and 30th possibly. Around there, the last weekend in September. Make sure that if you are going, go to your session. Your session is going to be amazing. I can tell already. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to seeing you in Atlanta. That's the show for this week. I want to thank Arin once again and clarify that the ALA Region 2 Conference is September 28th and 29th. Be sure to say hello if you see me. Questions, comments, and guest suggestions can be sent to Craig at SpeakerCraigPrice.com. And finally, subscribe to the podcast in iTunes. And if you can, leave a 5-star rating and some comments. We'd love to see some. Please. See you next week.